Hi, y'all. Welcome back. This is going to be chapter 2 from the textbook, Campaigns and Constituents. So we'll jump right into section 1, the intro. Um, and Congresspersons often have to decide between voting for their constituents or for the national interest, right? And this can be problematic for Congresspersons, right? Sometimes it will be in the national interest for you to vote for a bill while it could be against your constituents' interests. So you have to make a difficult decision between whether you represent your constituency, which can be very small, as little as about 700,000 today, um, to the nation as a whole, which is 330 million people, right? And so this is one of the biggest difficulties that congresspersons face. We should also know that there's this sort of ring of distrust, right? This ring. The further you get from your own individual representative of your district, the less trusting American citizens are, right? So American citizens tend to trust their own personal representative or their own personal senator far, far more than they trust other representatives or senators, and especially far more than the Congress as a whole, right? Which today has about a 9 to 11% approval rating, depending on which poll you look at. Um, so it's kind of a strange phenomenon that Americans trust their own politician very highly for the most part, but they don't trust the Congress as a whole. Okay, section 2, campaigning for Congress. The vast majority of sort of contemporary legislators spend an inordinate amount of time on fundraising, right? America doesn't really have any limits on how much you can spend on campaigns, for individual PACs, things like that. Most countries around the world have hard limits on how much you can spend, or even have a um, a nationally backed campaign system where, say, each candidate will get an equal $1 million or whatever, and that's all you get, and you can't raise further funds to try and even things out, right? The US doesn't do that, especially after Citizens United decision in 2010, which said that there can be no cap on spending, either for candidates or for outside groups, and that money is equivalent to speech. And so you cannot restrict how much speech by the First Amendment um, can be used, right? And so now we are seeing billions and billions of dollars flooding into political campaigns, and arguably the wealthiest Americans have more speech, right? Because they have more money. And so some people find this very troubling. I sort of won't give my own opinions on this, but it should be known that sort of post Citizens United, things have ballooned quite a lot on how much is spent on sort of PACs, right, political action committees, how much individuals and private corporations can give to candidates, things like that. We also know that the House and the Senate tend to have extraordinarily high reelection rates at around 95 to 96%. There are a couple of reasons for this. One is gerrymandering, right? So every 10 years we have the decennial census, which counts the heads of people living in America, whether citizens or not. And then we get redistricting. And when that redistricting occurs, each state legislature gets to redistrict generally as they will, as long as it isn't racially gerrymandered, according to the 14th Amendment. Though there are recent questions about how much that's being upheld. But gerrymandering is a really big one. It's where you sort of pack as many of your opponents in one district and then ensure all of the rest of the districts get say if you're in Texas, as much Republican coverage as you can possibly get, and then you'll pack as many Democrats as you can into as few districts as you can possibly create, right? And so a lot of the sort of political scientists and theorists say that like Texas is the most gerrymandered state in the union, that there should be many, many more Democrats than are allowed to sit. You also have things like franking privileges. Franking means that you can send out mail for free. Um, because you are a member of Congress, you have the right to send out congressional information to your constituents, and you don't have to pay for it. Um, so this is a huge privilege, right? You see a lot of toward election time, massive mailing campaigns, especially from those who are incumbents. You also have just plain name recognition, right? Um, you, as an incumbent, are more likely to be recognized than a challenger who your district may not know, right? And then finally, you have logistics for fundraising. You have operations in place and the logistics that you may have been building over years, which is hard to overcome for a new candidate because they have to build their own, from the ground up, from scratch, logistics to try and fundraise. Um, at this point, the major fear is not of being beaten in a regular election. The fear is about being primaried, right? And this is one of the reasons why um, American politics has become so extremist over time, is because of the primary system, because of gerrymandering, which gives you a safe seat if you're a Democrat in California or a Republican in Texas. The worry is that a primary candidate of your own party will actually outstrip you and take the primary election, whereupon when they move to the general election, they're basically guaranteed the seat, right? And so you get further and further and further extremism as members try to scrabble to show how extreme they are, because we know that primary voters tend to be the most extreme voters, right? And so if you want to win a primary, you have to pander to the extremists in your district. Um, and then it's hard to go back towards centrism once you've sort of outlaid this extremist plan, right? So if you look at someone like AOC in New York, or if you look at someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia, they spout some really, really extreme stuff, and it's because they don't want to lose a primary. They know that they'll, 99% likelihood says they're going to win the general election. What they're very scared about is being sort of outflanked in the primary system. Cat quit. Shake up. Okay, Section 3 is about political parties in Congress. One of the first things that we should ask and answer is, why do we tend to have only two parties? And the main answer is because of our majoritarian election system, or the quote, first past the post election system. We don't have a PR system, and we don't have sort of a runoff system if you don't hit the 50% plus one. You simply have to win the most votes. You don't even need a majority. And Duverger's law, Duverger is a very famous political scientist and economist from the 50s and 60s. Duverger's law says that, if you have these majoritarian electoral systems, you will almost inevitably get two-party political systems. And we see this around the world. We see this in the UK, we see this in India. India is a bit of an exception, but anywhere where you have these sort of majoritarian electoral systems, you tend to only get two parties, and any third party gets sort of crowded out. It is very rare that a third party candidate wins an election. There are a few examples, like Bernie Sanders from Vermont. He is what does he call himself? I can't even remember, something about socialism, but he's not a Democrat, right? And he's definitely not a Republican. But he has to tie himself to the Democrats, because if he didn't, he would have no power. He'd have no say whatsoever. And so he sort of ties himself with the party that is ideologically closest to him, even though he's not a member of that party, right? Um, we should also know a little bit of the history of the party system and about especially the party flip in 1964 and 1965. So, generally, the Democrats were from the South. They were called Yellow Dog Democrats, and Republicans were in the North. Until 1964 and 1965, LBJ came to power after the assassination of JFK, of Kennedy, and pushed through the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which basically enforced the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution and said that, what are they called? The Jim Crow laws of the South are no longer valid, that Black citizens must be allowed to vote and register without intimidation or violence. Um, that you cannot gerrymander based on race, all of these sorts of things. And at this point, the South was furious with LBJ, and so the parties completely flipped. And the North started to become the Democrats because they supported civil rights and the Voting Rights Act. And the South became Republicans because they did not want blacks to have these sorts of powers. And so this was a major turning point in the United States party system right in the mid 60s. There's a lot of things going on, right? Like the civil rights marches, the Vietnam War, a lot of drug and hippie culture, these sorts of things. But these two major acts that came from the LBJ administration, voting rights and civil rights, basically flipped the parties. And the Democrats moved north and the Republicans moved south, and it's been the same way ever since. Like we talked about earlier, the introduction of primaries has led to much greater extremism. This is because of the combination of gerrymandering and needing to not be outflanked in a primary system, and so it leads candidates to become more and more and more extreme over time. And we're seeing further and further and further separation between the two political parties. There's very little bipartisanship or cooperation or compromise these days. Everything is extraordinarily extreme, and they feel that they're trapped in this this cycle of extremism because they don't want to get beaten in a primary candidacy or in a primary election. And then finally, there is no such thing as a recall for either senators or House members. State level elections can be recalled in some states, like maybe a decade ago, California recalled their governor. That sort of thing is possible, but it is not possible at the federal level. You cannot recall a House member or a senator. Let's see, Section 4, the freshman class. The only thing I really want to point out here is that both houses, the Senate and the House, are becoming more representative of women and minorities. But we're nowhere near sort of equivalency, right? Like we're not even close to 50% women in the House and the Senate. We're not really close to the 13% threshold for African Americans or the, say, 30% threshold for Hispanics. So while we are making strides, I guess, toward what they call, what is the word for that? That's not important. Um, we are getting more representation for minorities and for women, but it's not numerically accurate, right? Okay, Section 5, serving constituencies. We should also note that staff work is heavily, heavily focused on constituency service. So the senator or House member themselves are often on the phone trying to drum up funds. The vast, vast majority of their time is spent on fundraising, and their staff's vast majority of their staff's time is focused on constituency service. So, like answering phone calls and emails and actual letters from the mail, sending out those informational campaigns through the franking service, which we talked about earlier, going to town hall meetings, things like this. Um, so yeah, a lot of the service that occurs Very little of the service that occurs, I should say, is actual legislation or research of legislation or writing new legislation. It's mostly based on constituency service and raising funds. And this is one of the biggest complaints of House members, especially, is that they're on the phone 5 days a week, 10 hours a day, calling constituents trying to beg for money. And it's becoming very frustrating for many of them. Um, and so, what we do about that, I'm not really sure. Uh, that will be that's a discussion for the future, I guess, and for the House members themselves as to whether they want to put limits on spending or these sorts of things. But it is generally the largest complaint that exists among House members today, and often even senators. All right, that's all I've got for you for chapter 2. Thanks for being here. The rest will be up shortly.